marriage and the domestic church as a means for holiness. So we're going to talk about two things. Marriage as a means for holiness, and then marriage as the foundation of the family. Okay, this is from John Paul II. So when we're talking about the family, the domestic church, what is that mission? The family has the mission to guard, reveal, and communicate love. And this is a living reflection and a real sharing in God's love for humanity and the love of Christ the Lord for the church, his bride. So we see that innate, immediate connection between the family and the greater mystical body of Christ, right? And that mission is to guard, reveal, and communicate love. Also from that other slide, we heard that definition of marriage as giving oneself in love, right? So here again, we have that the marriage and the family is a community of love, and it finds in self-giving the law that guides it and makes it grow. So the giving of self that inspires the love of husband and wife for each other is the model and norm for the rest of the family. So to kind of keep that idea of marriage as self-giving. And if we kind of pull those quotes all together, marriage as a means for holiness because it is a calling, a holy vocation, a participation in the life of God, and a mission. So in relation to each other and to God, each spouse works to give love with grace and become more united to Christ and to keep growing. So walking on that way to strive for holiness, right? Striving for perfection in the sense of loving perfectly, which of course involves that starting every day in reconciliation. And what about if we think of that from a psychological point of view? I think there's a direct overlap, really. So someone we're going to talk about today is Dr. Roberta Gilbert. She is a current psychologist who has been in charge of the Bowen Center for many years. She's one of the leaders. And she talks about bringing your best self to all of life's relationships as this idea of sort of the heights of psychological emotional maturity. So how can I bring my best self to my marriage, to my children? And in that sense, in a Catholic way, if we think about my best self, well, isn't that living my vocation? And so that's that same call to that sanctity and everyday holiness. So they have that same goal. Okay, what about this with marriage as the foundation of the family? So like we were just looking at, what that self-giving that flows between husband and wife is the foundation for the children. Psychologically, it's absolutely true. So a child is dependent in the state of responding to their environment basically until they can put a roof over their own head and are financially dependent, which these days is a little bit farther down the road, right? So overall, parent initiates, child responds. Parent initiates, child responds. And so we will talk more about the kids later on, but for right now, just to kind of lay out there, if parents aren't working on their one-on-one relationship with each other, then we can't work on the relationship with the kids, right? Stated in a positive way, when parents do make time for each other, the benefits automatically flow to the children. So that's that everyday renewal. And on that, I'm just going to do 2 pointers. Why making time for the two of you is so essential and how to practice that everyday renewal when times are tough. Date night. Okay, making time for the two of you. What's so important about this? So if we are setting time aside on the calendar and planning it out, then that puts us into a proactive mode, a planning mode, instead of just reactivity and letting the calendar run what we do, but the other way around, right? And so that just makes for less chaos in a family to set those priorities, to talk about those priorities, and to make those decisions out of our best thinking instead of just responding to what's happening in the moment. And that filters down to the whole family, right? When we're protecting time and setting priorities, that also just kind of helps the overall tone of the family. So setting aside that special time for the couple. And it also makes, you put into action what you already know. You guys know the marriage is the foundation of the family. And if you know that it is, then we have to put some like real actions behind that, right? So that communicates to the children, yeah, it's important for us to have time on our own. And that's also good for the children too, to have time on their own, to have to learn to entertain themselves if you have a relative or someone to be with them. And I know that's also a challenge right now with quarantine. So to try to be creative in that. And even if it's, you put on a movie and then you guys sit at the end of the driveway, right? Some space where the children are allowed to also have their own space, and there's a defined space without them for the parents. And you might even keep in mind too, that time also to talk about the two of you and not about the children, right? Oftentimes parents get some time alone and then what do? They talk about the kids. And so really sharing about each other, thinking of that self-giving. And then the bonus is that makes a legacy for your kids when they see, oh man, mom and dad like spending time together. Mom and dad are affectionate. I want to be like them. Okay, just a quick word on everyday renewal when things are tough. We do have some extra challenges right now as a society. And so just 3 short little things. Pope Francis first is going to give us 3 words. Really simple. If you haven't heard his catechism on this, it's just very sweet. And you can even go over it with your children. And he says that 3 expressions, please, thank you, and I'm sorry, are a foundation to living well in our family and to living in peace. And that even though they're really simple, they're actually not so simple to put into practice, and they hold a lot of power. He says the power to keep home life intact, even when tested with 1,000 problems. And so just remembering those 3 words when tensions are high, when we're tired, when everybody's been on Zoom calls all day, right? Please, thank you, and I'm sorry. And those again, everyday renewal. Each day we're sort of taking care of those relationships and not wearing the relationships out with stress. The second tip is to remain in a position, a curious position and a learner position. To think about life in this way of being a lifelong learner, learning about each other still. When we're tired or we're stressed, we tend to make assumptions. Oh, I already know what he's going to say, or I already know what she thinks. And to be able to stay open to learning, and well, maybe I'm going to learn something here, and what questions can I ask, and can I be curious about what's going on for the other person, and just show that interested curiosity. It's actually neurologically not possible to be curious and also anxious at the same time. So waking up this kind of learner position and curiosity helps with stress and anxiety. And then last, just remembering that relationship with God. And we'll get more into this in the next one. Nope, in this one. Here it is. Okay. So always going back to God as our main source of life, of energy, of inspiration. In the Catechism, there's this beautiful quote by Tertullian that says, "How wonderful the bond between 2 believers, now one in hope, one in desire, one in discipline, one in the same service, and they are both children of one Father and servants of the same Master." So there's this dynamic where there's 2 believers, but one bond, and then before God. I like to represent this with a triangle. It just kind of makes sense to myself, because you can see that you have the one-on-one bond between the spouses, and that also each spouse has a one-on-one bond with God. You've probably heard at least once that typical marriage homily where the celebrant talks about marriage as a 3-legged stool, right? And so a stool with 2 legs doesn't stand up, 3 legs it stands. So God's the 3rd leg, right? So just as an image for you, that not only do husband and wife have to come together in their relationship before God to pray together, but also each spouse to have their own one-on-one relationship with God in the privacy of their own soul. And that's where we can always go to refresh and to get new strength. And then just one last word on that, that when we are, plugging into that eternal source of energy, of life, of love, then the authentic married couple is caught up into divine love and is governed and enriched by Christ's redeeming power and saving activity of the church, so that this love may lead the spouses to God with a powerful effect and may aid and strengthen them in the sublime office of being a father and a mother. So basically, the strength of the sacrament, right? Parents aren't meant to do this on their own, but to do it with God because it is a divine calling. And by virtue of that sacrament, they can have this deep relationship where they're penetrated by the Spirit of Christ and increasingly advance the perfection of their own personalities as well as their mutual sanctification, contributing to the glory of God. Okay, so now we're going to do the second part, parenthood and the good of children as a means for holiness. I would be curious to hear your answers on this one. How has having children been a means to holiness for each of you? What about having children has challenged you in your own path to holiness? And what have you learned about educating your children in holiness? Or what have your children taught you about holiness? Pope Francis is, of course, a huge supporter of families. And I think it comes through in this quote. He says that no one can think that the weakening of the family as that natural society founded on marriage will prove beneficial to society as a whole. The contrary is true. It poses a threat to the mature growth of individuals, cultivation of community values, and moral progress of cities and countries. There's a failure to realize that only the exclusive and indissoluble union between a man and a woman has a plenary role to play in society as a stable commitment that bears fruit in new life. And so just kind of thinking about the national or global reality right now and remembering that what you do every day in your families matters. It matters to God. It matters to, of course, your children. And then it also matters to the well-being of your community and the nation. He says, but nowadays who's making an effort to strengthen marriages, to help married couples overcome their problems, to assist them in the work of raising children, and in general to encourage the stability of the marriage bond? Well, you guys are. I think it's absolutely great how your parish is making this family education and formation a priority during these times. And it's great that y'all can have access to formation right from home. I think we also have to talk about something similar for parents who are on their own. Who's making an effort to help them strengthen their family bonds, right? And I hope that such a family could also find some inspiration tonight. Okay, so back to the catechism. The family as being this place where from childhood one can learn moral values, begin to honor God, and make good use of freedom, that initiation into the life of society. So as the parents are, so are the children. So as we were talking about a minute ago, that marriage is the foundation of the family, right? And how the parents are striving for their holiness in their vocation automatically influences the children. And we also know this, so that's through the teachings of the church, but we also know this through just plain good psychology and good science, right? We now know so much more about the way that families are interconnected neurologically, physiologically, and that parents set the emotional tone of a household. Now, I hope that you don't see that as a pressure, but rather as a possibility, because if you can acknowledge how much influence you have, that can be also a very encouraging thing to know that if I can work on me and bring something good to my family, then automatically my children will be helped. And this is one of the principles that Dr. Murray Bowen founded his theory on, that one can slowly modify oneself. And if one can change oneself, the family will slowly change. Remember that self in relationship, right? We're so intimately intertwined that if one person works on themselves, the family automatically benefits. You don't have to do anything beyond that, like working on myself in relationship to others. And how does that match so well with what we were talking about with holiness, right? So working on being my best self, on giving of myself to the family, to the spouse and the kids, is a way of thinking about this path to holiness or sanctity. And we think about that in Bowen as like, does a person live according to their guiding principles? How much do they live out really what their values are? This is kind of a fun little vignette. There was a study done that Dr. Jenny Brown, another Bowen therapist, mentions, where they looked at the highest moment of parental anxiety in the US over the decade of the 1900s. And they asked, what most people thought it was. And some people thought, oh, it's probably like the 60s and 70s where all these kids were, running away, like the typical argument, right? Actually, the highest moment of parental anxiety was in the early 1920s when the first parenting manual was published. How about that? So it came out, in the Sunday paper about what a parent should be. And all of the parents started having these reactions of, wait, maybe I'm not a good parent. Maybe some other expert is going to tell me what I should be. And so in Bowen work, we work to flip that and help parents find their own authority again. And that each mother and father can ask themselves, wait, what kind of a mom or dad do I want to be? Not what does somebody else say that I should or shouldn't be, but what are my values? When I, wake up and think of this a day, like wanting to be the best mom I can or the best dad I can, what is that? And I think that harmonizes really well with our understanding in Catholic teaching that God gave each of us a personal mission, right? And so to strive for that ideal that God had in his own heart when he made you personally, and to work on that, to define it, to write it out. And this is that way of perfection or everyday renewal, growing and learning every day in holiness. Pope Francis says that with the parents leading the way by example in family prayer, children and indeed everyone gathered around the family hearth will find a readier path to human maturity, salvation, and holiness. So parents leading by example also in the life of prayer, right? If I have these values as a Catholic, okay, how do I action those, right? Do my children ever see me pray? Do I ever pray with them? And so Pope Francis is pointing this out with parents leading that way with family prayer. It just, flows to the family and makes that path to maturity and salvation and holiness. So the holiness of parents enables the life of grace to flow into the children. And this is also really powerful. Having a healthy father figure and healthy mother figure is how a child actually learns to love God as Father and also the Blessed Mother. Having that attachment on the natural plane is what enables the supernatural attachment. Pretty powerful. And of course, children also can help parents on their way to holiness because they continually make you go outside yourself and sacrifice and grow and keep us in that, humble learning position, right? And then lastly, also thinking about what the children can teach us, right? Unless you change and become like little children, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven. And so Christ lets us know they have something to teach us about holiness. And then this is just the last slide for this section, that a little bit from John Paul II. In this way, with parents working towards what are their values and how best to be a parent, in this natural authority they have, we can see that as participation in God's creative activity. And the very authority and love of God the Father and Christ the Shepherd and the motherly love of the Church is then being channeled through the parents into the family. Okay, so here's the last section. So I had been asked to talk about human development, child development over the lifespan. But in a general way, we can talk about this, that when a child is born, they are, of course, entirely dependent on the family, right? Primarily on the mother at first, and then on both mom and father. So that child physically, right, isn't going to make it without mom's nurturing, without being fed, without being taken care of. And well, and just in case I don't want to, dad's essential from point one, okay, but just the primacy of those 6 weeks, right? So on this little chart, if you think about the child's responsibility down here and the mother's up here on this other axis, then when the child is born, parental anxiety is at its highest. I'm sorry, that too. Parental responsibility is at its highest, right? The child is literally 100% dependent on the parents. Then that child starts to grow, 6 weeks, 8 weeks, 6 months, right? And it starts in little ways that the child is able to take care of themselves. They learn to self-soothe, right? When they learn to suck their thumb. They learn to start putting, Cheerios in their mouth. And so you can see these little tiny steps towards autonomy. They're born entirely connected, and of course in the womb, and that's even more, we could go one step back. And then the child, as they grow healthily, learns autonomy and starts to begin to differentiate a self from the parent, staying in deep connection with them, but having their own autonomy. And so the child's responsibility grows. That's the green arrow. First, they can put Cheerios in their mouth, then they can put their own shoes on, then they can, get dressed, and so on and so forth. And the moment where those two lines cross is adolescence. And that is when the burden of responsibility for self really starts to shift in a heavy way towards the growing child. And the parents really are, in that moment, able to and need to start stepping back so that the child is handling the responsibility for their life. Now, this is, in a sense, a moving target, right? When is it the child's responsibility and when is it the parent? I would like to encourage each of you to become experts on this for your own child. You know more than anyone about your kids. You're with them every day, right? And so thinking of their capabilities as a moving target and looking for those spots, when are they ready? And in that search, I recommend leaving a gap. So if I'm looking for the child's realistic capabilities and I undershoot their realistic capabilities consistently, that child doesn't have a motivation to grow, right? Mom's here, she's doing it for me. I don't need to tie my own shoes. But if I can wait, allow that child to get frustrated tying their own shoe and let them try again. And I'm present, I'm there if they really, need some help. I've already shown them how, but then I stand back, right? And I let them try it. And I leave that gap so that maybe they're trying something they don't quite have the capacity for, but I'm letting them try and struggle in that gap. Now that child is always geared toward growth in their autonomy, right? Whereas if I err on the other side and undershoot it, it interferes with their autonomy being able to grow. And so it's this process of observing, of being that expert on them, of reflecting about it. Okay, what have I noticed little Johnny doing for the past 2 weeks? What have I tried? What have I not tried? Okay, and out of that, I'm going to take and this or that action. And always kind of, again, shooting for your autonomy and leaving a gap. So the main rubric I'd like to leave for you as you're kind of searching for that space as the child is growing. Remembering this idea of a self in relationship we talked about in the beginning, and that there's always this moment of togetherness in relationships and this moment of autonomy. So there's that happens between the spouses, but then also between parents and the children. And so we're going to look at those two dynamics, autonomy and togetherness, as it applies to children. And I think if you use this rubric, it's going to simplify a lot of things for you. It'll help you keep a good eye on, are things going well for my child as they grow, or is there some place we maybe need to refocus and work a little bit on? So you can ask questions such as, how close am I to each of my children? And we're always looking for a balance between that autonomy and togetherness. And sometimes you might see that you have a different connection with one child versus the other. And of course, each of those connections are going to be unique. But you might find that you don't have as much as the development of a relationship with one or the other. Oftentimes with the families I work with, when I start off and a parent is very worried about a child, and I ask about, how close are you to them? How well do you know them? What their interests are, the time you spend? Parents start to realize, oh, yeah, okay, maybe this or that one. I haven't fostered that closeness as much. You can ask, is there any child which feels more distant? Any child to whom I react more strongly, who I maybe am more sensitive to in my reactivity? Is there any child that I'm particularly worried about? Do I worry about one of them more than the others? Do I ever repeatedly do something for my children that they are capable of doing for themselves? How often do I ask them questions instead of going ahead and telling them what to do? So you kind of get this idea of autonomy and togetherness. Now, in a healthy place, a parent is always able, well, and I shouldn't say always because it's an everyday thing, right? But in a healthy place as parents, you can decide whether to move closer to your child or to allow the child to have some time on their own, some autonomy, and also for you as well. And it's you that's making that thoughtful, conscious choice. When stress is high, when anxiety rises, anxiety makes that choice for us, and we either anxiously separate from the other or get too close, have an exaggerated connection where boundaries are blurred. And so I want this to be a way where you can kind of, again, keep an eye on how things are going. So in a place of mature autonomy, parent and child enjoy time together and apart. The child is expected to be responsible for themselves as a part of the family, right? We all contribute. The parent doesn't jump in too quickly to solve the child problems, and a parent pursues also interests outside of the children. And so the child's successes or failures aren't personalized or made, the only thing that the parent's life is about. And the parent also allows child to learn to soothe themselves. You're being present and you're accounted for, but again, you're not rushing in too quick, and you're considering that that child has an ability to learn to regulate their own emotions. And then in the place of mature togetherness, right, being able to enjoy that time together, there's warmth and affection. Parents openly share their values and thinking with the child. They're not threatened or bothered by child's questions about them. And then the child also can freely and openly share with the parents. Parents are able to not to hold strong limits and don't forego limits in order to achieve a sort of counterfeit closeness. And the parents don't overshare with the child. They keep adult issues between the parents again, so those boundaries are intact. When anxiety rises, these are two things that can happen in families, and it can be an up and down kind of thing, right? You might see more of these characteristics on one day or another. So it's important to know that this isn't a good or bad relationship. It's just what predictably happens when anxiety is present. And as soon as I'm aware, I can start doing something about it, right? Remembering that if I work on self, that automatically flows to the child, right? So I work on my own level of calm as a parent, and that flows to the child. So in anxious separateness, a parent might avoid or neglect making time for the child, be over-involved in separate things. They might distance from the child when there's a possibility for discord, kind of not talking about a difficult topic, avoiding telling the child what the parent thinks, especially on important issues. And this can happen more often as the child's getting into the preteen and adolescent years. And maybe allows the child to isolate in an exaggerated way, right? Whether they're young and they're on video games all the time, or whether they're teens and they're just in their room on their phone, right? You kind of get this idea that it's not just that healthy balance of privacy and time to be on one's own, but in exaggerated isolation. And then you might hear that in your own thinking or even in your words, you might kind of use labels or excuses or assumptions to talk about the child, but not actually to the child, right? So you kind of feel that worry that piles up and kind of spills out your ears. So that would be like an anxious separateness. An exaggerated connection, on the other hand, would be, again, those boundaries kind of disappear. And the parent is overly in tune with child's emotional states. If child's upset, parent's upset. There's very poor boundaries. Parents might take the child's actions or words personally. He did this on purpose, he did that, X, Y, or Z. They might insist the child approve or like of parent decisions, right? Kind of looking for that peer relationship, or be uneasy with holding limits or uneasy when the child naturally pushes back. They might prohibit that child's autonomous thinking about family values and demand that they agree, right? And so not allowing the child to think through things and be able to decide. And not tolerating child's distress well. So kind of when the child is sitting there trying to tie their shoes, right? Just jumping in to soothe too quickly. So this is, again, I hope it's just kind of a little bit of a rubric thinking of autonomy and togetherness for you, so you can feel equipped to be that leader in your own household and be able to just kind of recalibrate when things are off in that everyday renewal, right? And so that's my hope for that. And as we wrap up here, a little bit more from Dr. Roberta Gilbert, she talks about how replacing the worried, anxious focus with confident interest in the child leaves the life problems of the child for the child to solve. So the parent will stay alongside, be interested in active communication, but not take it on. So that's that place of really fostering that child's individuality and that little person that's growing and that has their own path to holiness, right? Their own unique identity. And so the parent stays connected, but in a very open, calm way, so the child can kind of rise to the occasion of those struggles. And then also that parents are the hope of civilization. Much depends on whether parents can connect in a meaningful, positive way with each other and with their children. If they can, a generation may emerge ready to tackle and reverse some ominous trends. So I hope that is, again, this gives you some encouragement, a little bit of inspiration. We ask our Mother of Good Counsel, who has all this wisdom, to pray for us, and encouraging you that with God and the Blessed Mother, they're at the center of your families. You can always go back and back to that eternal source of all life, energy, and inspiration to keep nourishing your families in this everyday renewal on this path to holiness day by day in your blessed vocation as parents. The end. Thank you very much for your time this evening, and God bless.